Finally kicked the bucket, huh? Well, that means the $8 million inheritance is ours now. It's the season where people on the streets talk about how tomorrow will likely bring snow, their breath visible in the chilly air. My father, who was always kind, has gone to heaven. Normally, one would feel sorrowful, but instead of tears, my mother and sister are practically laughing with joy. I couldn't forgive these heartless people. But little did I know at the time that they would eventually shed tears too. Only my father knew that. You listening? Just because we have money doesn't mean we can be extravagant. You should be content for what you already have. My father used to say that like a mantra since I was little. As a child, I didn't understand what he meant, but I admired his conviction. It seems my father had worked hard, prioritizing his job over hobbies and personal matters, striving for a better future. Even after starting a family, he didn't change his ways. He'd head to work before we woke up and return home after we'd already gone to bed. Thanks to him, we never struggled financially. But according to my mother, we could have lived a wealthier life. That man prioritized work so much that he saved almost everything, leaving us with no room for some indulgence. He was just inherently frugal. I was blind not to see it. When my father wasn't around, my mother would confide such things to me and my sister. They were complete opposites in every aspect. While my father was serious and work-oriented, my mother never pursued a career. She wasn't exactly diligent with house chores either. She wouldn't wash dishes unless asked, and there were countless times she forgot to add fabric softener to the laundry. So, by the time I was an upper elementary school student, I was doing most of the household chores. Despite having 2 children, my mother always maintained a youthful and beautiful appearance, often mistaken for being in her 20s. Now that I'm an adult, people sometimes even mistake us for sisters. My father, though not conventionally handsome, had a kind personality and many friends. Misfortune struck my father in the winter just before I graduated middle school. He suddenly lent a large sum of money to a junior colleague. The amount was in the millions. When my mother heard about it, I think that was the angriest I'd ever seen her. Why would you lend a huge sum to a junior colleague when you never give any large amount to your family? He was in trouble. I had no choice. Don't worry, he's not the type to run away with the money. Let's trust him and wait. My father was too good-hearted, but not everyone is like him. The junior colleague, upon receiving the money, immediately moved away. As a result, we were forced to live a modest life for the time being. And because of this, my mother and sister began to despise our father. He may have taken the money, sure, but the fact remains that we helped someone. Acts like that always come back to you. It's not true that honest people always get taken advantage of. There's a saying, what goes around, comes around, right? My father told me that. It was tough when we were living modestly, but I still admired my father for trusting someone so much. He had always been someone I looked up to. However, about 5 years after I started working, my father suddenly fell ill. It seemed that the years of hard work had finally caught up with him. Despite being at an age when he could still work, he found it difficult to even get out of bed. Though he kept a smile on his face in front of us, I could never forget that there was a lonely expression on his face when he occasionally looked out the window. When my father needed more care, my mother immediately suggested sending him to a nursing home. My sister agreed, but I didn't want to do that. Since he wasn't completely helpless, I suggested hiring a visiting caregiver instead. But my mother insisted that if I felt that way, I should make the arrangements and pay for the care myself. Yeah, if you feel that strongly about it, then arrange it yourself, and you'll pay for the care, right? Yeah, you should do that. It would be a waste to use the family's money for caregiving. Since all the money was what my father had earned, it wasn't fair for my mother and sister to say such things. I couldn't leave it to people like them, so I decided to arrange everything as they said. Fortunately, I was able to find a diligent and great person named Mr. Smith, and the fee was surprisingly low. It was an amount I could easily afford with my salary. Although my mother and sister didn't look too pleased, I was satisfied. Mr. Smith had recently moved to the neighborhood and was just looking for work. He was a bit younger than my father, and they had developed a close relationship beyond employer and employee. My father had always loved chess, but none of us knew the rules, so we couldn't play with him. However, since Mr. Smith started coming, he began playing chess with my father, and his expression became brighter and brighter. Sir, you are good, aren't you? But I won't lose to you just yet. Mr. Smith, you are strong. It's been decades since I've had such a tough match. When my father was with Mr. Smith, he was lively, and I thought as long as he stayed like this, he would be able to enjoy himself for a long time. However, my father's health was steadily declining. In the third winter since the caregiving began, my father's condition suddenly deteriorated, and his consciousness began to cloud over. Then, as I was taking care of him, in a small but clear voice, he left me some meaningful words. "I'm entrusting this house to you." Despite how happy he had seemed, a few days later, he went to heaven. Mr. Smith also mourned my father like a family member. He even came to my father's funeral, and despite the work contract being over, he offered to help clean up the house. "I'm indebted to your father, you know. I wouldn't be able to forgive myself if I didn't do this much." Mr. Smith and I sorted through my father's belongings together. My mother and sister, however, were more concerned about something else. "He's gone now, so the inheritance is ours, right? He had about $8 million saved up and also owned real estate property, didn't he? I'm looking forward to it." The two of them had been talking like that next to Dad's grave the whole time. Unable to bear their grating, high-pitched laughter, I couldn't help but speak up. "You two are being too much, aren't you? Dad would cry if he heard you." As I shouted with tears in my eyes, my sister furrowed her brow. "Trying to be a good person, just like Dad, but being too kind like that, you'll end up losing out like Dad did, right? Honestly, Dad was such a fool. Is it really so wrong to do something for someone else? Is believing that kindness will always be rewarded really so foolish? We lived modestly, but it was a comfortable life. Isla, you're just like our foolish dad. Both your stubborn ideas and that ugly face." With a face resembling my mother's, my sister looked down on me. "Stop it. It's unfair to compare yourself to your sister." Even Mom would say things to encourage my sister. If Dad knew how awful our family was, what would he think? I couldn't help but feel frustrated thinking about Dad being talked about like this, especially after all he'd done for us. As I trembled with anger that couldn't be put into words, Mr. Smith gently tapped my shoulder. "Please stop arguing in front of your father's grave. He would have hated that the most," Mr. Smith said quietly, handing a piece of paper with a certain phone number written on it to my mother. "What's this?" "It's the phone number of the lawyer your father had made arrangements with before he passed away. He said to contact them if anything happened to him, since the will is already taken care of. I think it's best to have a proper discussion after finishing sorting out his belongings. We should just toss out all his stuff. The inheritance should come first, right?" Suddenly, Mother's eyes sparkled, ignoring Mr. Smith's words and immediately calling the lawyer. "Hello, I heard that my husband consulted with you about inheritance matters. Can you come over right away? We need the money." Both Mr. Smith and I were astonished by how disgraceful my mother was over the phone. Soon after, the lawyer arrived. Mother quickly asked the lawyer, "My husband's inheritance must be worth millions, right? Tell me about the contents of the will." The lawyer, somewhat taken aback by Mother's eagerness, took out documents from his bag and solemnly began to read the will. "I will now read the deceased's will. The legal heirs of my estate shall be limited to blood relatives only." Then the lawyer continued, "Therefore, there will be no inheritance for my so-called wife and younger daughter. The inheritance will go solely to my eldest daughter," he said. I was speechless. Before I could fully grasp Dad's words, Mother snapped at the lawyer. "Wait a minute. It's ridiculous that there's no inheritance for me and younger daughter. No, this is the result of a thorough investigation." As Mother and my sister listened with flushed faces, the lawyer began to explain calmly. "First, ma'am, you did not apply for marriage with the deceased. According to the deceased's family records, you are not listed as the spouse. Therefore, he is considered single." Upon hearing this, Mother's expression clouded. As the lawyer had said, Mother hadn't applied for marriage with Father at the city office. To begin with, Mother had never intended to marry Father. She had approached him only to get close to a wealthy man and enjoy a lavish lifestyle, expecting to break up soon and not wanting to tarnish her own family history. Well, maybe that's true for Mom, but I'm Dad's child, right? Why is there no inheritance for me? As for your case, the deceased had requested a DNA test. The results showed that you are not his biological daughter. What? I'm not Dad's child. As my shocked sister looked at Mother, her complexion grew even worse. The deceased mentioned something about an affair. Were you having an affair? He knew. It seems so. Despite that, he forgave you and took care of both you and your daughter. I see. Dad was always too kind. He had been with Mother and forgave her all this time, just like with his former junior colleague. Truly, it was so characteristic of Dad to live his life like that. However, even after hearing that, Mother and my sisters seemed unable to accept it. Don't be ridiculous. Even if I had an affair, it's already irrelevant. He didn't even bring it up before. To do that now is so petty of him. I've been doing chores and taking care of things for decades, and it's awful to be repaid with ingratitude. The one who stood up upon hearing those words from Mother was none other than Mars Smith. He had been listening quietly until now, but he now sternly addressed Mother. What does someone like you know about him? Petty? Don't make me laugh. I've been observing the family closely for these past few years, and what you're doing is beneath contempt. You only care about money, so you have no right to denigrate him. Suddenly overwhelmed by Mr. Smith's furious outburst, Mother and my sister completely lost their nerve. Mr. Smith, thank you for defending Dad. I'm really happy that you've come to care about him so much in just a few years. A few years. Haha, it's actually different. I owe him a lifetime of gratitude. What do you mean by that? I tilted my head in confusion, and Mr. Smith proceeded to tell me everything. It turns out, Mr. Smith was a junior colleague of Dad's who had borrowed millions of dollars from him. After borrowing the money, he moved his hometown in another state to work tirelessly to repay the debt his family owed. Thanks to the loan, he was able to turn around his family's business, but it took several years to get back on track. When he moved, he lost his cell phone and couldn't be contacted. Finally, after preparing the money to repay Dad, he returned to our town. And when he saw Dad was looking for a caregiver, he applied and came to our house. Dad seemed to have recognized Mr. Smith through their shared love of chess, and they became close like they used to be. Being able to repay him in the end is all thanks to the money he lent me. If it weren't for that, our family might not have been able to live properly. I made sure to pay back the money before he passed away. That amount has also been added to his inheritance. Then, Mr. Smith continued to address Mother and my sister, saying, he decided to leave the inheritance to his eldest daughter. He said, the eldest daughter values people's feelings more than money. She doesn't get blinded by money like her sister or my wife. Money can be trusted with someone who knows to be content with what one has. After that, Mother and my sister didn't say anything. I decided to inherit Dad's estate as it was and moved out of the family home. 1 year later, I decided to establish a nursing home for the elderly on a hill overlooking the sea in a city far from home. I wanted to use Dad's inheritance not for myself, but for someone else's happiness. And I also decided to have Mr. Smith work as an employee there. There's no one as trustworthy as him. There was still some inheritance left, even after spending so much money. After some consideration, I decided to distribute a substantial amount of money to Mother and my sister. Dad helped people in need, so I'll help Mom and my sister too because I believe in them. I handed over a total of $2 million. Given what happened this time, I thought they would at least use it carefully, but within a year, they demanded more money. Despite all that was said, it seems they used it all for indulgences. I can't lend money to untrustworthy people anymore. Having lost my trust, both of them now had to work day and night to pay off their debts. It's a shame that they didn't learn anything despite having a role model like Dad so close to them. I lived modestly, saved for the future, and settled into a stable life, just like Dad taught me. That's enough for me. It's what my beloved father taught me.